important cause. Now I got to caution everyone, I've been out of office as mayor for 8 years, so I rarely get a platform, so I want the doors sealed. Air conditioner set at 40, you're going to listen to me for about 45 minutes and then no. In all seriousness, a little story about why this is so important, and then introduce our very, very special speaker. I was just telling a gentleman next to me at our table that in today, this is a great example of government knows best, and I'm a Democrat saying this. There's a church, Kevin knows the church, Georgia Avenue in Washington, D.C. It's Emory Baptist Church. So this Baptist church, their church home, is a beautiful old historic building going all the way back to the Civil War. This is true. But the church, God bless them, they want to take the value of their land, and guess what? They want to convert that value into affordable housing. Now, come down the road, all the we know best historic preservationists telling the church what they can or can't do with their property, and we'll let you know what you can or can't do with your property according to our discretion, and we're going to let you lose your tax credits because we're not giving you a predictable process. This is horrible. This is a nightmare trying to make things happen on a local level. Another story. So my granddaughter goes to a school called Howard Early Learning. Again, Kevin knows this program. Acclaimed program. All the kids do very, very well here. Now this is hit. We still don't have enough, despite everything positive that's happened, because we don't have enough school choice. Today, in Washington, D.C., my granddaughter and her friends have been essentially relegated to these schools. Now this is hit home. And this is an important part of the conference this afternoon as we talk about how to energize and educate and get parents to connect the dots. This is hit home. This is very, very important. Has a very, 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 very high level of urgency. And it's important that we have leaders who can take the way. And that's the speaker we're going to hear in just a second. I'll tell you, during my time as mayor, I was president of a group called National League of Cities. And I was supposed to go to Kentucky to speak in Kentucky. It was bad weather in Washington, so my detail, we drove out to this outlying airport, I forget where it was out in West Virginia or something, to take this small plane into Kentucky. And my assistant freaked out and bailed out of the trip when out of the flyer's office comes Jed Clampett. And she's like, she freaks out. She said, I'm not going on this trip. But, because, I had to do my job, so I got on the plane with Jed. And we made it to Kentucky perfectly fine. I gave my talk. And then I was on my way back. I went back out. I talked to, Captain Clampett said, well, how to go back to Washington? And he says, interesting. He said, there are old pilots, and they're bold pilots, but they're no old, bold pilots. Except for the very few, he said, who know risk in a very, very tense, difficult environment. And ladies and gentlemen, our speaker, Senator Joe Lieberman, who he'll hate to admit, and I hate to admit, I've known for a long, long time, way, way back, is someone whose career continues to this day, fighting for the right things, but also taking risks. Someone who understands, as Thomas Edison said, nation without implementation is an hallucination. So whether it's crafting a bipartisan form and recognizing our key allies, whether it's making policies work in this country and providing choice and real opportunity for families, Joe Lieberman has fought this fight and continues to fight this fight today. Let's give him a big, rousing welcome, Senator Joe Lieberman.
Thank you, Mayor. Thanks, ladies and gentlemen, for that really warm welcome. Only my friend Mayor Tony Williams could get away with publicly calling me old, by calling me old and bold, and I appreciate it very much. I was looking before you did that wonderful introduction, which I appreciate, that I was thinking Governor Walker, I was a little jealous of him. He was introduced by justice, and I was thinking I would be introduced by truth. and the rest of the meeting will be about the American way, right? Tony and I met each other long ago when he was an undergraduate at Yale and got involved in local politics. As we were joking, one of the turning points of his career was when I became Attorney General of Connecticut, and I offered him a position in my office, which he turned down. He said, probably a big mistake. I said, probably not. You'd probably still be there. He's done wonderful work, and it was a great personal pleasure for the wheel of life, the circle of life, to turn around for me to work with him in the Senate, particularly on the DC Opportunity Scholarship Program. Thanks to all of you for being here. Let me begin with Betsy DeVos. Thanks to you. You're typical of the people who fill this room. Your family's worked very hard. Your family's been blessed. You don't need to do what you're doing in the American Federation for Children. But you're doing it because you want to make a difference for the better for our country. And I can't thank you enough for that. You're typical of people throughout the hall. I want to begin with a story that maybe you've seen before. Somebody sent it to me just a couple of weeks ago. It's as follows, written by a gentleman. One morning, he says, I was walking along the shore. As I looked down the beach, I saw a human figure prancing around like a dancer. I smiled to myself, thinking that someone would dance by himself on the beach, so I began to walk faster to catch up. As I got closer, I saw that this was a young man, and he wasn't dancing. He was reaching down to the sand, picking up something, and very gently throwing it into the ocean. So as I got really close to him, I shouted out, "Good morning. What are you doing?" And the young man looked up and replied, "I'm throwing starfish into the ocean." And I, the gentleman says, asked, "Why are you throwing starfish into the ocean?" And the young man answered and said, "The sun is up and the tide is going out. And if I don't throw them in, they will die." I said to him, "Young man, that's very thoughtful of you, but don't you realize that there are miles and miles of beach and tens of thousands of starfish all along it? You cannot possibly make a difference." The young man listened politely, and then he bent down and picked up another starfish, threw it into the sea past the breaking waves, and said, "It sure made a difference for that one, didn't it?" Well, when I read that story, I must tell you, I thought of the American Federation for Children, because I think that story says it all. There are children in the public schools of America who are being left on the sand as the sun goes up because they don't have the ability, that they're not getting the ability that God has given them and that our Constitution and Declaration promised them to swim out with the tide. And we're all about, in this movement, trying to help them do that, exactly that. I can't tell you how happy I am and grateful in this post-public service, post-elective office part of my career to have the opportunity to work with the American Federation for Children. I wanted in this new chapter of my life to be able to continue to work on some of the programs that I felt were most important that I worked on when I was in the Senate. And why this one? Simply put, I believe that there isn't anything, any single issue, domestic issue, more important for this country that I love so much than to liberate more of its most poor children from failing schools. That's what we're about. And I want to approach this in a somewhat personal way. I want to speak to you personally about how I came to the school choice movement and I want to speak to you politically, because although I was re-elected to the Senate in my last campaign as an independent, I remain, that's because the Democrats kicked me out, you know, I had no choice. I remain a registered Democrat. As one of my friends said to me, I don't understand, if the Democratic Party for you at this point is like your appendix. It's serving no function, but it's still part of your body. So anyway, I really want to speak as a Democrat. And I want to speak through you and help you perhaps to speak to my fellow Democrats. Let me begin personally. All four of my grandparents were immigrants to this country. Neither of my parents had the opportunity to go to college. My mother and dad began working at jobs when they were teenagers, just to help support their families. My parents gave my sisters and me, two sisters, a real confidence that if we worked hard, there was no limit to what we could achieve in America. They really believed in the American dream. And they always said to us that the ladder up was education. And that we had the privilege of being able to go to public schools, and if we worked hard in those schools, there was no limit to what we could achieve. Well, my sisters and I took that all seriously. I went to the public schools of Stamford, Connecticut. I got a great education, and when it came time to go to college, I had a dream, which my dad, who spent some of his childhood in New Haven, encouraged, that maybe I could get into Yale, and I did get into Yale. And that 4 years, and then the 3 years at law school afterward, really transformed my life. How did I get involved in public service? In part, it was from my mom and dad were religious. We were raised in a religious family. We were given the religious imperative to be of service, to try to make the world better than we had found it. That was our responsibility. I also read a lot of history in high school and college and biography, and was impressed by the difference that leaders could make for good or bad in the history of the world. And then in 1960, Senator John F. Kennedy ran for President of the United States. And for me, and not just me, but a lot of people of my generation, that was a call to public service. Ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. In that remarkable inaugural address that President Kennedy gave in January of 1961, he said, and this related so much to my upbringing, that about the American creed, the rights of man, we believe, come not from the generosity of the state, but from the hand of God. And then went on to talk about the Central American ethic ideal of freedom and equal rights and equal opportunity. I took that seriously in college. I got involved in the civil rights movement, somewhat in New Haven, but really most importantly to me, going to Mississippi for a while as part of a Freedom Vote campaign in 1963. And after I came out of law school, I decided that I wanted to try my hand at a public service career. When it came to choosing a party, it was quite natural that I would be a Democrat, both because my family were all Democrats, although I must admit that later in life, my dad admitted to me that in 1944 he voted for Wendell Willkie for president. Apparently he thought Franklin Roosevelt had had enough time and he wanted to give somebody else an opportunity, but also it was the Kennedy, it was the JFK ideal that carried me into politics. Throughout my career in politics, I made, I apologize, I don't mean to brag about this, I'm just trying to explain how I got to where I am on school choice. I made civil rights and human rights really a center of what I was trying to do. For First, obviously, for people of color, then for women, and on, but of course more recently in our time, although we began this fight in Connecticut in the 70s, to protect people from discrimination based on their sexual orientation. I was a state senator in the 1970s, the whole decade, and quite naturally, one of the things I did as a representative from New Haven, West Haven, was to work for the schools of those centers, and I was pretty successful at it. But as time went on and I would visit the schools, I would meet with parents, particularly in the African American community, I really began to ask myself the question that this movement asks, and beyond us, which is we've got to stop spending all our time fighting about how much money we put into the educational system. We've got to ask educators. And you know, I had reality, which was the goal, the insight parents gave me. Schools would be the ladder up for my sisters and me in America was not a real promise for a lot of our poorest children anymore, because they were not getting an opportunity, an education that would even put them on the ladder to go up. The numbers that document the failure, and these are numbers that are more recent than that time in the late 70s and early 80s when I started to change my opinion about this, but you know these numbers. Every 26 a child drops out of a public school in America. In most of our largest cities, less than half of the students graduate from high school. Now, what an indictment of for equal opportunity, particularly in the modern information technology society, where education is even more important than it used to be. What are they going to be able to do to live lives that are self-sufficient and satisfying and provide for their children? By the time I got to the U.S. Senate in 1980, I was ready to try to support alternatives to shake up the education status quo in America. And the first thing I did was to work with Senator Dave Durenberger, a Republican colleague from Minnesota, because in Minnesota the charter school movement began. And we created the first, I'm proud to say, federal program to support charter schools. During the 90s, occasionally one of my colleagues, always a Republican colleague, will put in a school amendment, and I would vote for it. And as I continued this wayward pattern, my Democratic colleagues would sort of look twice at me and say, "What's going on?" And I would say, what I just said to you, the public schools are not working for our kids. Look, what are we Democrats supposed to be about? I became a Democrat because it was the upward mobility party, the equal opportunity party, the civil rights party. And today, in basically, if I may, in the schoolhouse door, school children are used to liberate their, to open that door and let them out of those failing. We're doing exactly the opposite of what the what I thought this party was about. And Coates, and incidentally, it was not just Kennedy, but this whole ideal goes back to a few other earlier Democrats called Jefferson and Jackson. I thought about equal opportunity and equal rights. Another important moment for me, I'll tell you this story. At one point when I introduced legislation, one of my Democratic colleagues, in a way to explain used that term intentionally, said to me, "I figured it out. I finally figured it out why you're school choice programs. It's because you're under pressure from the Orthodox Jewish community. I said, you know, strangely enough, it's really the Roman Catholic community that I'm under pressure from. I mean, I've since talked to Orthodox Jewish groups about this and how important these school choice programs are, but really, we had a bishop named Edward Egan, later went on to be New York Cardinal Egan. He was he was in the parochial school system and took me around on one occasion to visit the schools in the greater Bridgeport area. And now these schools that have been originally built to educate the children of waves of Italian, Irish, Polish, Catholic immigrants, full of African American and Hispanic American kids, almost all of whom were not Catholic. And it was a remarkable mission that was being carried out, and he told me, really convinced me what was obvious, which what a hard time they were having in sustaining those schools economically. For me, this all came together, the producing school choice programs and others, Rick Santorum, in the DC Opportunity Scholarship Act, which seemed to me to be the perfect package. Okay, we're going to try to give a test, but we're not going to take money away from the public schools, which is one of the arguments made against school choice. We're going to give an equal amount to the charter schools, which are choice but part of the public schools, and to school choice schools, DC Opportunity Scholarship. We worked very hard. Kevin Chavez was phenomenal. Tony Williams was phenomenal. I'll write a book about it. We probably 1,500, 2,000 students. You know this, but the DC Opportunity Scholarship Program was not a merit selection program. It was a lottery, basically. And, you know, there were some kids who were gifted and some less, but 90%. So what a dramatic case to be made. Unfortunately, the Obama administration cut back the funding for the program. We went through a tough time. It just made no sense. We argued, but we came up against a wall. But when John Boehner became the Speaker of the House, it was a wall against a wall. And Boehner was basically saying he was not going to crack. I can tell you, and I'll tell you briefly, I've told it to some of the American Federation for Children groups before, that there was one session of the many that have gone on with the federal budget in crisis, where Boehner's staff and the staff from the Obama administration and the Senate Republicans were negotiating, and they had an agreement, they thought. And John said, just one thing more. You've got to put the money back in that you took out for the DC Opportunity Scholarship Program. Well, I thought we had an agreement, the administration said. No, he said, we never said we had an agreement. We agreed on everything but that. And the fellow representing the administration said, Mr. Speaker, you're not going to hold up the whole budget for the DC Opportunity, one program. I think it was 60 million overall, out of billions, trillions. And Boehner said, yes, I am, and I will. And and they put the money back in. Now, again, this year, this is like an annual game. The administration has kept the money out of the budget to sustain the program in Washington at the levels it's at. I predict to you here, and there's not much I feel comfortable predicting about politics anymore these days, is that if there is a federal budget, the DC Opportunity Scholarship Program will be funded. If it's not, there won't be a federal budget. So, look, what's the story here, and why are I must say that there were a small handful of Democrats in the Senate, Dianne Feinstein, now Cory Booker, Mary Landrieu used to be the senator from Louisiana, was a supporter, but a handful, honestly, you could count them on the fingers of one hand, of Democrats in the Senate who would support school choice. And in my opinion, it is so inconsistent with what is supposed to be the philosophy and purpose of the Democratic Party that, unfortunately, and I hate to say this, but there's no other explanation, people in the party are putting the interests of individual children and poor children aside to serve and basically show their dependence on the teachers' unions and those who are working with them. It's an outrage. It is an outrage. So how do we turn this around? I think in the first place, truth over here has to confront this reality. All of us have to speak truth to Democrats and say, remember what this party is supposed to be all about. Incidentally, I was thinking the other day, in the presidential campaign this year, there's going to be a lot of talk about populism, about the small, the large against the big interests. School choice is a populist issue. It's about little people, literally, children who are poor, who are being frozen out of a better education, kept off the ladder up in American society to a satisfying and better life. And why? Because of political dependence on some organized, powerful special interest groups. You are the Davids fighting Goliath here. But remember, David won that battle. So we can do it as well. The other thing is to organize the public, because really it is populist in that sense too. Organize parents of children, particularly in lower income areas. Anytime you see a poll in a lower income area about how they feel about, what do you think about the school choice programs, overwhelming support, because the parents are parents. They know their kids are not getting the education they want them to get, but they know they can't afford to send them somewhere better. Now, I want to say to you that the one most significant transformational movement on this subject in America today is the American Federation for Children. Because you are reaching out not just to Republicans or not just to anybody based on party, but you're making the case so strongly on the merits, but also by building political grassroots support underneath. That now in states like this, Louisiana, where there is a school choice program, the last time I looked, half of the Senate Democrats were for it, more than 25% of the House Democrats. In Florida, which has a school choice program that involves 70,000 students, there's increasing Democratic legislative support and very significant growing African American support. And yesterday in New York, Governor Andrew Cuomo, in a series of stops in New York, again reaffirmed his support for school choice, for a tax credit program in New York, and predicted that this year, 2015, would be the year it happened. Now that's a big deal. So you've got the Democratic governor of a very blue state saying he's for school choice. Why? Because it's going to help the children of the state, and as anybody knows, you educate a child, that child is going to be a productive citizen of the state. We estimate now that there are 360,000 children, probably more now, in America who are in school choice programs. To a certain extent, you might say every one of those is a starfish that has been picked up and given assistance to be in the living waters to swim out and making something of their lives. This is not a partisan issue. It's only the special interest groups that make it a partisan issue. School choice is about as American as the promise in the Declaration of Independence about the self-evident truth that everyone is endowed by our Creator with those rights of life, liberty, and happiness, which cannot be enjoyed without a good education. So I want to say to you today, be very proud as members of this national school choice movement, American Federation for Children and the allied groups, of what you are accomplishing. You have made a tremendous difference. But we know there are hundreds, thousands, millions more children who still need our help. We have a lot to do before we can rest. And I love those boxing gloves, because there's nothing as satisfying as a good fight for a good cause. And there's none better than this cause. We will, with God's help and your help, save the lives of millions more children by giving them and their parents the school choice they have a right to as Americans. And when we do that, we will make our beloved country the more perfect union that our founders dreamed it would be. Thank you. God bless you. Have a great conference. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Senator Lieberman, you've been a true champion for the kids in this country, and particularly, as I know firsthand, the children in Washington, D.C., and we thank you so much. You and Senator Feinstein were stalwart supporters, but you were the one who led the way when we were having those very difficult days. So we want to thank you again. Thank you so much for your leadership. Thank you. So I am going to take personal privilege, since I didn't get a chance to acknowledge my friend and former adversary, Tony Williams. 17 years ago this summer, Tony and I were locked in a battle to see who would be the next mayor of the District of Columbia. And I want to share two stories about our growth toward each other as opposed to the fight we had when we were against each other. Right after the primary was pretty contested, and I did not immediately endorse him. And so lo and behold, I got a call from my parents in Indianapolis, Indiana. And they said, you know that boy who beat you in the primary? His mother is sitting in our living room. Tony's mother actually flew to Indianapolis, Indiana, and said that if your son and my son come together around the issue of education, then they can do great things for the kids of D.C. She said that within days of the primary, and rest her soul, Virginia Williams and Betty Chavis helped bring us together. So thank you to the memory of both of them. Very true story. The other thing is, though, mothers aside, we still had the political reality of having had a spirited race, and we were fighting against each other, and I was part of the loyal opposition, and I sued the mayor when he closed our public hospital. We still need to talk about that, but anyway. And we were sitting in a budget meeting after he had been in office for about a year, and the other members of the council, we were talking about the budget, and when it was time to talk about the charter schools and choice, Tony and I ended up weighing in on behalf of reform. And when they were talking about trying to figure out the budget, our colleagues in the council were on one side, and me and Tony were on the other side. So, I put him aside and said, hey, Tony, what's up? He said, I actually believe in this stuff. I said, well, I do too. And I think that very moment, and he and I talk about it quite a bit, it changed everything. Because we both had an unyielding belief in the potential of our children. We had both been sort of grounded in the reality associated with the political wars of D.C. at the time. But more than anything, we realized that together, if we joined forces, then we could work magic for kids. And when we came out for the D.C. Opportunity Scholarship Program that folks like Senator Lieberman and Senator Feinstein and John Boehner and others helped us with, we worked with President Bush and Secretary Page, and Howard Fuller helped bring us all together. When we sat down and the press was giving us a hard time, he said, well, Kevin, I got your back. And I said, Tony, I got your back. And now 7,000 children later, 90% of those 7,000 children have attended college. I want to thank Tony Williams personally for your support in making that happen. In order to fight for educational choice, you need to have a willingness to fight. And I think that this willingness to fight transcends party, politics, it transcends race, ethnicity, it transcends all of those superficial variables that really have nothing to do with what's best for children. And those of you who have been allies in this movement for so many years, you intimately understand that. And I think that through this gathering today, we celebrate the need to come together on behalf of America's children to make sure we give them the educational opportunities they richly deserve. So thank you all for that. We will have our breakout sessions in about 30 minutes. The schedule can be found on the screen that will come up behind me. And prior to dinner, at about 5:15 in the Strand foyer, we're pleased that we will be having a book signing for the one and only Dr. Howard Fuller. I think he's here. Is Dr. Fuller here? I want you to stand up. We always got to lift up some love for Howard Fuller. Senator Lieberman and I share this love of history, and you know, I've always been like a little boy sitting at Howard's knee to hear his walk through history. And if you read that book, it is like a walk through history and his journey towards school choice. So thank you all very much, and we'll see you later on this evening. Thank you.